Every serious sailor in Northern Europe knows the letter X, not as a name, as a standard. Walk any marina from keel to cows, and someone will point at a hull with that single black letter on the bow and lower their voice slightly, the way people do around something they genuinely respect. X-Yachts, the boat that wins on Tuesday and takes the family out on Saturday. The boat that shows up on a start line against a dozen professional-grade racers, and then, that same weekend, almost none of the people saying that name with respect know it started in a barn. Because before X-Yachts sat at the top of European sailboat racing, it was three men with no factory, no capital, and one design nobody had asked them to build. In 1979, brothers Niels and Lars Jeppesen, together with boat builder Birger Hansen, had their first success. The boat was built in Hansen's own barn, not a facility, not a plant with a name and a sign out front. A barn in Haderslev, a small harbor town on the Baltic coast of southern Denmark that had no reputation in yacht building whatsoever. Nobody in the sailing world had a reason to look toward Haderslev in 1979. There was no yard there. There was no history there. There was a barn, some fiberglass, and three men who thought they had figured something out that the established builders had missed. The boat was called the X-79. The name came from its length, 7.9 meters, and the year it launched, 1979, a simple naming convention that would end up defining decades of model names to follow, right down to the boats the yard builds today. It was designed to answer a specific question the Danish sailing scene was already asking out loud in every clubhouse. Could a boat be fast enough to actually win and still be affordable enough for a weekend sailor with a day job to own outright? It was the Danish response to the J24, the Alban Express, and the Maxi 80 Racer, three boats that already had loyal followings across Scandinavia and a head start of years. The Jeppesen brothers and Hansen were not entering an empty market. They were entering a crowded one, from a barn, with no name recognition at all and no dealer network to lean on. The barn-built prototype did not stay quiet for long. The X-79 won the Danish Sjælland Rundt race and then went further, taking the prestigious Swedish Tjörn Rundt, at the time the biggest race in Sweden, with more than 2,000 yachts competing on the water that day. A boat built by three men with no factory had just beaten the entire Scandinavian fleet, in public, with everyone watching, on a rule set that gave no mercy to a badly built hull. That is the moment the orders start. That is always the moment. Not the founding, not the barn, not the first sketch on a piece of paper. The moment strangers who have never met you decide to hand over money because they watched your boat win against fields, stacked with boats from yards that had been building for decades. Over 500 X-79s were eventually built, and by the time the model's production run wound down, 468 had left the yard between 1979 and 1994. A 15-year production life for a boat that started as a barn project, answering a question nobody had commissioned. For a first design, that is not a niche success. That is a new category of boat builder announcing itself to an entire coastline and then to an entire continent, one regatta result at a time. Here is the question X-Yachts asks at every decision point from this moment forward, and it is the question that separates them from almost every production boat builder in the world. Does the racing pedigree survive the transition into cruising comfort, or does one get quietly sacrificed for the other? Most yards pick an answer early and stay there for the rest of their existence. Build the race boat and accept that families will find it too stripped down and uncomfortable to live aboard for a week at a time. Or build the comfortable cruiser and accept that it will never win anything against a serious fleet on a Saturday morning start line. X-Yachts refuses to pick. That refusal becomes the entire identity of the company, repeated across 4.5 decades and nearly 60 different hull designs. Throughout the 1980s, X-Yachts designed and built winning boats under the International Offshore Rule for World-Class Racing, the sport's toughest handicap system at the time, a rule that punished any wasted ounce of fiberglass and rewarded only genuine speed, not marketing. The yard was not building boats for people who wanted to feel fast at the dock while sipping a drink. It was building boats that had to actually be fast against professional caliber fleets, underscoring that left no room to fake it, no room for a nice paint job to cover a slow hull. And that racing success is what pulled in a market the yard had not originally set out to serve. The yard's answer was not to spin up a separate, softer product line and let the racing boats fade into a legacy footnote nobody remembered. It was to take the hull knowledge earned on the racecourse, under real competitive pressure, and rebuild it around a family's weekend. The X412 became the first model in this new performance cruiser range, and it was followed fast, one hull after another, almost annually. The X512, the X382, the IMX38, the X442, the X362, the X332, the X302, the X612, the X482, and in 1999, the X562. 10 hulls, one underlying philosophy, repeated and refined at every size, from smaller weekend boats up through serious offshore cruisers capable of crossing oceans. The X99, introduced in 1985, became one of the most enduring one-design classes the yard ever built, staying in production until 2004 with 605 hulls constructed, and it is still competing in its own dedicated world championship decades after the original mold was cut, a fleet of owners still racing boats built when the Berlin Wall was still standing. The X102, built between 1981 and 1987, won the International Three-Quarter-Ton Cup in back-to-back years, 1981 and 1982, with 173 units produced. This is not a yard that built one hit design and coasted on it for 40 years. This is a yard where the racecourse kept handing it fresh proof, decade after decade, and the yard kept turning that proof directly into boats a family could actually own, insure, and sail on an ordinary Saturday without a professional crew. By the new millennium, the pattern is unmistakable, and the yard is no longer a regional Danish success story confined to Scandinavian waters. The IMX40, launched in the early 2000s, became a dominant performer under IMS and IRC rules, and the IMX45 repeated that success in 2002, an almost unbeatable competitor in its class year after year. The same era saw the yard launch the X-Yacht 73, its entry into large, comfortable cruising yachts, a scale the Barn and Haderslev could never have imagined back in 1979, when the biggest concern was fitting a boat inside a barn door. The monotype X35 became the backbone of a genuine global one-design racing fleet, with more than 200 hulls competing worldwide by 2007, recognized as an official class in regattas far outside Denmark's own waters, from the Mediterranean to the North American East Coast. Then the trophies start arriving from outside the racing world entirely, from judges who evaluate boats on everything at once: speed, build quality, livability, innovation, finish, and resale value. In 2007, the X55 won European Yacht of the Year. In 2009, the XC45 won it again. Two different boats, two different classes, one yard, proving the same point twice within 3 years, to a panel that had no reason to favor a small Danish builder over the continent's biggest names. By 2012, the numbers tell the story the racecourse already knew for years. Annual turnover reaches $42 million, with more than 5,000 yachts produced since the company's founding. A barn in a small Danish harbor town, run by two brothers and a boat builder with no outside funding and no inherited industry connections, had become one of the most decorated performance sailboat builders on Earth, a name spoken with the same respect in Newport as it was spoken in Haderslev. That same year, ownership shifts. A new investor enters, and Danish entrepreneur Ib Kunoa's holding company, Consolidated Holdings, takes majority control, eventually owning 84% of the yard. This is the exact fork in the road where so many builders lose themselves entirely. New capital arrives, and the temptation is always identical. Cut the racing pedigree because it is expensive and unprofitable at scale, chase cheaper volume, sand off the very details that made the brand mean something to the people who bought into it first, back when it was still a barn with a big idea. X-Yachts does not take that fork. The company's founders retain ownership stakes and hold on to key management and design positions, rather than getting quietly pushed out the door once the money changed hands. Niels Jeppesen, the naval architect behind essentially every hull the yard ever built up to that point, continues designing for the company for years afterward. And his design philosophy, hull shapes built to minimize wetted surface area for speed, paired with interiors built for real family life rather than showroom appearance, remains the yard's operating doctrine, even under the new ownership structure. The people who built the barn boat are still in the room when the big money decisions get made, which is precisely the thing that usually disappears first after an acquisition, replaced by executives who never sailed the boats they now control. The build process itself is where the philosophy gets proven again, year after year, boat after boat, long after the founding generation started handing off responsibility. In 2018, the yard introduces epoxy-infused construction across its entire model range, a vacuum-infused composite technique that squeezes out excess resin and produces a hull that is lighter, stiffer, and stronger than the layup methods that came before it. It is the same question the barn asked back in 1979, just answered with 40 more years of engineering behind it. Can this boat be lighter without becoming weaker? Can it be faster without becoming less safe for the family standing in the cockpit in a building C, miles from the nearest harbor? Today, the operation that Niels and Lars Jeppesen and Birger Hansen started with no factory has become a global name built on a very small, deliberate footprint. Primary production remains in Haderslev, Denmark, the same town where none of this had any right to begin, supplemented now by a facility in Poland handling molding and epoxy infusion at scale. Roughly 200 to nearly 300 people work across the operation, and the yard sells through a network of 40 independent dealers spread across 22 countries, concentrated in Europe and North America, exactly the markets where sailors already know what the letter X on a bow is worth before a salesperson says a word. Annual production sits at approximately 150 yachts a year, a number the yard has held deliberately rather than chasing the volume growth that hollowed out other builders once outside investors got involved and started asking for bigger numbers every quarter. Over its 45-year history, distinct designs from the 7.9-meter one design racer that started it all in a barn to luxury cruisers stretching into superyacht territory that would have seemed like fiction to three men with $0 in outside funding. Every one of those 60 designs traces back to a hull philosophy first proven under real competitive pressure on a race course, then carried, unchanged in spirit, into the cabin of a family cruiser headed nowhere in particular, just out for the weekend. Not every founder gets to watch the outcome up close. In 2005, Niels Jeppesen moved to the UK and eventually ended his formal association with X-Yachts, going on to design for other yards under his own name and his own reputation, built entirely on what he had proven in Haderslev. Of the original three founders, only Birger Hansen still works for the company today, the last man from that barn still walking the factory floor. The barn is long gone. The men who stood in it are mostly gone from the org chart too. But the question they answered with the X-79, whether a boat could win on the race course and still bring a family home safe and happy, never left the drafting table, no matter who signed the ownership papers or how many zeros came after Consolidated Holdings' name. That is the difference between a brand that gets bought out and hollowed for its name and a brand that gets bought out and keeps its soul. X-Yachts changed owners without changing what an X-Yacht actually is. No rebadged hulls wearing a new logo and a six-figure markup. No stripped-down entry line built from the cheapest available materials because a holding company needed a bottom rung to hit a volume target. Every boat with an X on the bow still has to answer the same question a barn in Haderslev asked back in 1979 on a boat named for its length and the year it was born. Can this hull win? And can this hull bring you home?